In my decades treating patients in Britain's most troubled areas, I've observed a phenomenon that would be comical if it weren't so destructive. The very people who preach radical egalitarianism live lives of exquisite privilege, while advocating policies that devastate the communities they claim to champion. These well-heeled progressives inhabit neighborhoods where their experimental social theories never penetrate, sending their children to schools insulated from the chaos their ideologies create elsewhere. I've witnessed firsthand how their compassionate rhetoric translates into systematic cruelty for those unfortunate enough to live under the policies they promote. The liberal elite's hypocrisy isn't merely amusing, it's a key mechanism by which contemporary society perpetuates the very inequalities it claims to abhor. Today, we'll examine this peculiar form of moral schizophrenia that allows privileged intellectuals to feel virtuous while ensuring their own comfort remains undisturbed. The evidence lies not in abstract theories but in the concrete realities I've observed in emergency rooms, prison hospitals, and the homes of those who bear the consequences of elite benevolence. Chapter 1: The Geography of Progressive Virtue. From my consulting room windows in working-class Birmingham, I could observe the stark contrast between progressive theory and lived reality. The most ardent advocates of open immigration policies invariably lived in neighborhoods where newcomers couldn't afford the rent. Those who championed comprehensive education most vehemently enrolled their own children in private schools or moved to catchment areas where house prices effectively excluded the underclass they claimed to represent. During my years working with prisoners, I noticed their most sympathetic advocates among social workers and probation officers drove home each evening to suburban enclaves that bore no resemblance to the communities they served professionally. These well-meaning individuals would spend their days explaining how crime resulted from social disadvantage, then return to neighborhoods where such disadvantage was systematically excluded through property values and zoning regulations. The hypocrisy extends beyond mere residential choices. I've encountered countless examples of progressive parents who publicly support comprehensive education while privately tutoring their children, advocate for community schools while selecting the most academically rigorous institutions available, and champion diversity while ensuring their offspring's peer groups remain comfortably homogeneous in terms of class, if not always race. This geographical segregation isn't accidental, it's essential to maintaining progressive ideology. Distance from consequences allows theoretical compassion to flourish unimpeded by empirical evidence. The liberal professional can support policies that increase crime rates because crime doesn't touch their daily experience. They can advocate for educational theories that damage working-class children because their own children never encounter such experiments. Consider the phenomenon of gentrification, which progressives simultaneously celebrate and condemn. They move into previously affordable neighborhoods, driving up prices through their purchasing power, then express concern about displacement of original residents. Yet this concern never translates into self-sacrifice. They don't move out or sell at below-market prices to preserve affordability. The result is a peculiar form of moral entrepreneurship where virtue signaling substitutes for actual virtue. The progressive elite has discovered they can feel morally superior while living lives of material comfort, provided they maintain sufficient physical and social distance from the consequences of their preferred policies. This distance isn't merely physical, it's intellectual and emotional, sustained by elaborate theoretical constructs that rationalize the gap between their principles and their practices. Chapter 2: Educational Apartheid: How Liberals Preserve Class Advantage. The most revealing arena of liberal hypocrisy lies in education, where progressive parents perform extraordinary intellectual gymnastics to reconcile their egalitarian rhetoric with their exclusive practices. Having worked with families across the social spectrum, I've observed how educated progressives game the very system they publicly support while denouncing others for doing precisely the same thing. These parents typically begin by championing comprehensive education in principle while researching catchment areas with surgical precision. They speak eloquently about the benefits of diversity while moving to neighborhoods where house prices ensure their children's classmates come from similar backgrounds. When this geographic strategy proves insufficient, they discover sudden religious callings that qualify them for faith schools, or develop passionate interests in particular pedagogical approaches available only at selective institutions. The linguistic contortions required to maintain ideological purity while securing class advantage would be impressive if they weren't so damaging. Progressive parents describe their school choices using euphemisms that obscure their fundamental similarity to the behavior they condemn in others. They don't seek better schools, they seek institutions with different learning environments that happen to coincide with higher test scores and university admission rates. I've witnessed families spend thousands on tutoring while publicly opposing additional support for academically ambitious children, arguing it creates unfair advantages. The irony escapes them that their private tutoring achieves exactly what they prevent schools from providing publicly. Their children receive intensive academic preparation while they vote for policies that deny similar opportunities to families who cannot afford private alternatives. The psychological mechanisms underlying this behavior reveal deeper truths about progressive ideology. These parents need to believe their advantages result from merit rather than privilege, so they construct elaborate narratives about their children's unique needs, special talents, or exceptional circumstances that justify educational choices unavailable to others. When confronted with evidence that their behavior contradicts their stated principles, progressive parents often respond with variations of, "I have to do what's best for my child," while continuing to advocate for policies that prevent other parents from exercising similar choices. This reveals the essential selfishness masked by progressive rhetoric, the desire to preserve advantages while appearing to support equality. The educational choices of liberal elites create a particularly insidious form of class reproduction because they're justified through apparently principled positions about social justice. Their children attend schools surrounded by other children of educated, affluent parents, while these same parents support policies that concentrate disadvantaged children in failing institutions, often described as resource-rich learning communities, to obscure their obvious deficiencies. Chapter 3: The Moral Luxury of Other People's Consequences. Progressive ideology functions as a luxury good available only to those sufficiently insulated from its practical consequences. In my clinical practice, I've observed how abstract compassion correlates inversely with exposure to its real-world applications. The most fervent advocates of lenient criminal justice policies typically live in neighborhoods with private security and robust police presence, while supporting reforms that increase crime in working-class areas. This dynamic creates what I term consequence displacement, a system where policy advocates enjoy the psychological benefits of moral superiority while others bear the material costs of their principles. The upper-middle-class progressive can support drug decriminalization because addiction doesn't penetrate their social circles, advocate for homeless accommodation because it doesn't affect their property values, and champion restorative justice because they're unlikely to encounter its beneficiaries personally. During my years treating prisoners, I noticed their most vocal supporters among university faculty, social workers, and legal advocates typically lived in circumstances that made criminal victimization statistically negligible. These individuals could afford to view crime through theoretical lenses because they never experienced it as immediate threat. Their compassion for criminals flourished in inverse proportion to their exposure to criminal behavior. The psychological comfort derived from progressive positions depends entirely on distance from their implementation. Consider how liberal attitudes toward personal safety correlate with residential choices. Those who advocate for criminal justice reform most strenuously also invest most heavily in systems, gated communities, private schools, suburban isolation, that minimize their contact with the populations they champion. This pattern extends beyond criminal justice to encompass virtually every area of progressive concern. environmental activists who fly frequently while demanding transportation restrictions for others, feminists who employ domestic workers while criticizing workplace inequality, and multiculturalists who live in demographically homogeneous communities all exemplify the same phenomenon. Moral positions become luxury goods signaling sophistication and virtue to one's peer group while imposing costs exclusively on others. The intellectual infrastructure supporting these positions requires constant maintenance through euphemism, selective attention, and willful blindness to contradictory evidence. Progressive media, academic institutions, and social networks collaborate to sustain narratives that allow privileged individuals to feel virtuous while maintaining privilege. Alternative perspectives are dismissed not through engagement with evidence but through moral condemnation that questions the motives of those who notice inconvenient patterns. The result is a form of moral aristocracy where virtue signaling substitutes for virtuous action, good intentions excuse harmful consequences, and social distance enables ethical blindness. The liberal elite has discovered they can purchase moral authority through ideological conformity rather than personal sacrifice, creating perverse incentives that reward positions which feel good rather than do good. Chapter 4: Immigration, the ultimate NIMBY issue. Nothing reveals the hypocrisy of liberal elites quite like their approach to immigration, a perfect example of policies they enthusiastically support provided the consequences occur elsewhere. During my medical work in diverse urban areas, I observed firsthand how immigration affects working-class communities while the middle-class advocates of open borders remain comfortably insulated from any resulting disruption. The same progressive professionals who denounce immigration restrictions as xenophobic or racist live in neighborhoods where recent immigrants cannot afford to settle. They send their children to schools where new arrivals speaking limited English don't disrupt classroom instruction, work in industries where increased labor supply doesn't depress their wages, and utilize public services in areas where additional demand doesn't strain capacity. When working-class communities express concerns about rapid demographic change, pressure on public services, or labor market competition, progressive elites dismiss these observations as ignorance or prejudice. Yet these same elites carefully avoid circumstances where they might experience similar pressures themselves. Their virtue signaling depends entirely on maintaining geographic and social distance from immigration's practical consequences. I've witnessed the psychological contortions required to maintain this position. Liberal professionals will celebrate diversity while living in expensive areas that effectively exclude most immigrants, praise multiculturalism while enrolling children in schools with carefully curated student populations, and condemn working-class concerns while ensuring their own circumstances remain unchanged. The economic dimension of this hypocrisy proves particularly revealing. Professional jobs typically enjoy protection from immigrant competition through licensing requirements, educational credentials, and social networks that preserve opportunities for established populations. Meanwhile, these same professionals support policies that increase competition for manual laborers, service workers, and others without similar protections. Consider how progressive rhetoric frames immigration debates. Opposition becomes hate, practical concerns become phobia, and demographic realities become social constructs. This linguistic manipulation serves to prevent honest discussion about immigration's actual effects while maintaining moral superiority for those whose circumstances shield them from negative consequences. The healthcare system provides especially clear examples of this dynamic. Affluent areas rarely experience the strain on emergency services, overcrowded clinics, or communication difficulties that characterize immigration's impact in working-class neighborhoods. Middle-class progressives can therefore maintain romantic views about diversity and cultural enrichment while working-class families deal with longer waiting times, reduced service quality, and cultural tensions in schools and neighborhoods. When confronted with evidence of negative consequences, liberal immigration advocates typically respond with abstract arguments about historical precedent, economic benefits, or moral obligations that ignore immediate practical realities affecting particular communities. They can afford such abstractions because their own lives remain concretely unaffected by the policies they promote. This pattern reveals immigration as the ultimate NIMBY, not in my backyard, issue for liberal elites. They support increased immigration enthusiastically provided it occurs in somebody else's backyard, affects somebody else's schools, and transforms somebody else's community rather than their own. Chapter 5: Language as a Tool of Class Preservation. In my decades of clinical practice, I've observed how progressive elites employ linguistic manipulation to obscure their hypocritical behavior while maintaining moral authority. They've developed an elaborate vocabulary that disguises self-interest as principle and personal advantage as social justice, creating what amounts to a class-based dialect that signals virtue while preserving privilege. Consider how educational choices become redefined through progressive terminology. Private schools become independent schools, suggesting liberation rather than exclusion. Selective institutions become specialized programs, implying academic focus rather than social filtering. Moving to expensive neighborhoods for better schools becomes choosing the right environment for our children's development, rather than purchasing educational advantage through property values. This linguistic reframing serves crucial psychological functions for liberal parents who need to reconcile their behavior with their ideology. By redefining their choices using progressive vocabulary, they can maintain their self-image as social justice advocates while acting precisely like the privileged conservatives they claim to oppose. The language change doesn't alter the behavior, it simply makes it psychologically bearable for those committed to egalitarian principles. The phenomenon extends throughout progressive discourse, creating parallel vocabularies that describe identical behaviors differently depending on who performs them. When working-class families seek better opportunities for their children, it becomes white flight or abandoning public education. When professional-class families make identical choices, it becomes finding the best fit or maximizing educational potential. Criminal justice provides another arena for linguistic manipulation. Progressive professionals advocate for restorative justice, community supervision, and rehabilitation programs, while living in areas where robust law enforcement, private security, and social isolation provide actual protection from crime. The therapeutic language obscures the reality that their safety depends on traditional deterrent measures they publicly oppose. In healthcare discussions, affluent progressives champion universal access and health equity while utilizing private insurance, concierge medical services, and geographic proximity to premier institutions that ensure superior care for themselves and their families. The egalitarian rhetoric masks behavior indistinguishable from that of openly elitist conservatives. Environmental discourse reveals similar patterns. Wealthy progressives advocate for sustainable living and carbon reduction while maintaining lifestyles, frequent flying, large homes, energy-intensive consumption that would be environmentally catastrophic if adopted universally. The green rhetoric provides moral cover for continued privilege while advocating restrictions that would primarily affect others. The linguistic strategies serve broader class interests by preventing honest examination of progressive hypocrisy. When behavior is redefined through ideologically appropriate language, criticism becomes more difficult because it requires engaging with constantly shifting definitions and euphemisms rather than observable actions. This verbal manipulation creates what I call semantic privilege, the ability to redefine one's behavior through ideologically correct language while condemning identical actions performed by others. Progressive elites have discovered they can maintain both material advantage and moral authority provided they employ the appropriate vocabulary to describe their choices. The psychological comfort provided by this linguistic buffer reveals the essentially performative nature of much progressive ideology. The language matters more than the behavior because the language signals group membership and moral status to one's peers while the behavior serves material interests that ideology supposedly opposes. Chapter 6: The Psychology of Progressive Privilege. My psychiatric training and decades of clinical observation have revealed the psychological mechanisms that allow liberal elites to maintain their hypocritical positions without apparent cognitive discomfort. These individuals have developed sophisticated mental defenses that protect their self-image while preserving their material advantages, a form of psychological compartmentalization that would be clinically fascinating if it weren't so socially destructive. The primary mechanism involves what psychologists call cognitive compartmentalization, the ability to hold contradictory beliefs in separate mental spaces without experiencing the discomfort that normally accompanies inconsistency. Progressive parents can genuinely believe in educational equality while ensuring their own children attend superior schools by maintaining separate cognitive categories for general principles and individual circumstances. This compartmentalization depends heavily on rationalization, the construction of seemingly logical explanations for behavior that actually serves self-interest. Liberal professionals become expert at generating principled-sounding justifications for choices that happen to benefit them personally. They don't seek advantages for their children, they simply respond to unique needs or special circumstances that coincidentally require expensive or exclusive solutions. The psychological comfort derived from progressive identity creates powerful incentives to maintain ideological consistency at the verbal level while allowing behavioral inconsistency to continue unexamined. Being perceived as virtuous by one's peer group provides sufficient psychological rewards that actual virtue becomes unnecessary. Indeed, actual consistency might threaten the material advantages that ideological membership helps preserve. Group reinforcement plays a crucial role in maintaining these psychological defenses. Progressive professional communities create echo chambers where everyone performs similar acts of cognitive compartmentalization, providing mutual validation for hypocritical behavior. When surrounded by others making identical compromises, individual inconsistency becomes invisible because it's universally shared. The phenomenon reveals deeper truths about moral psychology. For many individuals, appearing virtuous matters more than being virtuous. Signaling compassion provides greater satisfaction than practicing compassion, and belonging to ideologically correct groups offers more psychological reward than behaving consistently with stated principles. Projection serves as another crucial psychological defense. Liberal elites often attribute the motivations underlying their own behavior, seeking advantage, avoiding consequences, protecting privilege, to their ideological opponents while maintaining different explanations for identical actions when performed by themselves or their allies. This allows them to condemn others for behavior they practice routinely. The intellectual sophistication of progressive professionals aids this psychological project by providing elaborate theoretical frameworks that justify practical choices. Academic training in particular seems to enhance the ability to construct complex rationalizations that obscure simple self-interest. The more educated the individual, the more sophisticated their capacity for self-deception becomes. Status anxiety plays a particularly important role in maintaining progressive hypocrisy. Many liberal professionals depend on their ideological positions for social standing within their communities. Admitting the inconsistency between their principles and practices would threaten not just their self-image but their social position, creating powerful incentives to maintain psychological defenses against uncomfortable self-awareness. The result is a form of motivated blindness where intelligent, educated individuals become systematically unable to perceive obvious contradictions in their own behavior while maintaining perfect clarity about similar contradictions in others. Chapter 7: Breaking Free from Elite Moral Theater. After decades observing the destructive consequences of progressive hypocrisy, I believe recovery requires honest acknowledgement of the gap between liberal rhetoric and liberal practice. The first step toward authentic social improvement involves abandoning the moral theater that allows privileged individuals to feel virtuous while perpetuating the problems they claim to solve. Genuine progress begins with honest assessment of policy consequences rather than noble intentions. Instead of evaluating positions based on how they make us feel about ourselves, we must examine their actual effects on the communities they supposedly serve. This requires abandoning the comfortable distance that allows abstract compassion to flourish while concrete suffering continues. The working-class families I've treated understand realities that progressive theory obscures, that good intentions without practical wisdom often produce harmful outcomes, that policies promoting dependency ultimately damage those they claim to help, and that rhetoric about equity means little when accompanied by behavior that preserves inequality. Breaking free from progressive hypocrisy requires several concrete steps. First, we must insist on alignment between principles and practice. Those advocating educational equality should send their children to the schools they support for others. Immigration advocates should live in communities experiencing rapid demographic change. Criminal justice reformers should reside in areas where their preferred policies are implemented. Second, we need honest discussion about trade-offs rather than magical thinking about policies that supposedly benefit everyone. Real compassion requires acknowledging that most social interventions involve costs and benefits that affect different groups differently. Pretending otherwise serves the psychological needs of elites rather than the practical needs of those policies claim to help. Third, we must restore geographic and social integration that prevents consequence displacement. When policy advocates experience the results of their preferred approaches directly and immediately, positions tend to become more pragmatic and less ideologically pure. Distance enables fantasy, proximity demands realism. The medical model provides useful guidance here. In clinical practice, we evaluate treatments based on outcomes rather than theories, adjust approaches when evidence suggests they're not working, and maintain direct contact with those affected by our interventions. Social policy could benefit from similar empirical rigor and personal accountability. Traditional institutions, family, community, religious organizations, offer alternatives to the progressive model precisely because they typically involve direct relationships and immediate consequences. When we help family members, neighbors, or fellow congregants, we directly observe whether our assistance proves helpful or harmful, creating natural feedback mechanisms that ideology often prevents. Personal responsibility remains central to any authentic solution. The progressive emphasis on systemic explanations for individual problems, while sometimes valid, often becomes an excuse for avoiding the difficult work of personal improvement. Real compassion involves expecting the best from people rather than enabling their worst impulses through endless excuses. The path forward requires intellectual honesty about human nature, moral courage to challenge popular illusions, and practical wisdom to distinguish between policies that feel good and policies that do good. Most importantly, it demands that we judge ourselves by the same standards we apply to others, living according to the principles we advocate rather than using ideology as a psychological comfort that excuses practical inconsistency. Conclusion. The hypocrisy of liberal elites represents more than mere personal inconsistency. It's a systematic barrier to addressing the social problems they claim to champion. By allowing privileged individuals to feel virtuous while maintaining privilege, progressive ideology has become a sophisticated mechanism for preserving inequality while appearing to oppose it. The working-class communities I've served for decades understand what progressive theory obscures, that authentic compassion requires practical wisdom, honest assessment of consequences, and personal sacrifice rather than mere rhetorical sympathy. Until we abandon the comfortable illusions that allow good intentions to substitute for good outcomes, we'll continue cycling through policies that serve the psychological needs of elites rather than the practical needs of those they supposedly represent. The choice before us is clear: we can continue the moral theater that enables progressive hypocrisy, or we can demand the intellectual honesty and personal consistency that genuine social improvement requires. Real change begins when we insist that those who advocate for policies must live with their consequences, when virtue signaling gives way to virtuous action, and when the distance that enables elite moral tourism finally collapses into the proximity that demands practical wisdom.